The main objective of labour statistics is to provide accurate descriptions of the size, structure and characteristics of participants in the labour market and its changes. This is an area where the realities of women and men are different and need to be addressed. It is important to identify differences between women and men in access to employment and in what way the work of women differs from that of men. Differences can be found in hours worked, type of tasks carried out, and income earned. Did you know women account for only 7% of directors of world corporate boards? In South and Eastern European countries, women's share of managers is as low as 13%. In 2005, in Central and Eastern Europe and CIS countries, women accounted for about 32% of all workers in industry. In the European Union, women accounted for about 32% of all managers. When labour statistics make the distinction clear in the realities of employment for men and women, users are able to understand and analyse the particular position and constraints of women as workers and relative to men workers. Only when these differences are statistically captured can they be appropriately addressed. High quality, and by high quality we mean complete labour statistics, provide a solid basis for promoting equality between women and men in the labour market. What is actually captured by labour statistics? The first and most important factor to be explored is coverage. The contribution of women in the national economy is often subject to underreporting and misrepresentation. This is due to the type of work activities women tend to perform and the social roles traditionally assigned to women. Labour statistics are, in general, successful in identifying and characterising core employment or unemployment situations, focusing only on workers in full-time regular jobs in formal sector enterprises. But many women are engaged in casual, part-time, unpaid, seasonal work, often carried out in or close to the home and integrated with housework. In addition, women's traditional role as housekeepers tends to make them invisible as economic agents in the labour market. Clearly, the coverage of labour statistics needs to be improved to cover all work situations, including these atypical work situations in which women are often found. Therefore, in order to produce valid, reliable labour statistics, a good understanding of the work women do and the way society perceives it is a prerequisite. Gender roles are a second important factor to be taken into consideration. They have a strong impact on women's and men's participation in the labour market and also on its measurement. We are all familiar with commonly assigned gender roles, such as women's roles as housekeepers and economically dependent members of the household, and men's assigned role as breadwinner and decision-maker. The traditional family caretaker role can impede women from working. This role can prevent them from looking for certain types of jobs, or even looking for work at all. In some cases, women are not free to work without approval of their husband or other male family members. These barriers may be imposed by social and educational conditioning, hindering competitiveness to allow women to work on an equal footing to men. An Azerbaijan survey on attitudes regarding gender roles illustrates these points quite clearly. About 36% of women and 42% of men stated that there is no need for women's employment if their husband's income is sufficient. Let's look at the 4 key steps to incorporating gender in labour statistics. As a first step, we determine the topics to be covered in a survey. Hereby we focus on the issues that must be addressed in order to describe equally women's and men's economic activities. This helps us explain the differences and similarities between men and women in the labour market. Step 2 sets the definitions for each variable and of their classifications. Ultimately, all variables need to reflect equally well the different work situations of women and men. Once we are clear on definitions and classifications, we can move on to the third step, taking a closer look at the measurement methodology. The goal is to ensure that all work situations are clearly and consistently identified during data collection and processing. In the fourth and final step, we finally explore the best ways to present and disseminate the results in such a way that differences and similarities, as well as their causes, are clearly highlighted. After our brief overview of the 4 steps, we can now go on and explore each of the 4 steps in more detail. Let us start with the first step, which is at the very core of how gender data is generated and analysed. As we will show in this presentation, disaggregate labour statistics by sex can only be a beginning. All conventional topics in labour statistics are relevant to reflect gender distinctions, but special attention should always be paid to those topics where gender disparities are higher. Examples of such topics are informal employment, the gender pay gap, occupational segregation, entrepreneurship, casual work, place of work, and balancing family life and work. How can we best tackle these topics? To better describe men's and women's different contributions, labour statistics should cover and separately identify work which is carried out in combination with domestic chores, as often occurs in agricultural activities. We will need to also capture multiple activities and work done at home. Clearly, subsistence, informal sector, domestic activities and intermittent work, as well as unpaid services, will need to be separately identified as well. And the list continues. Topics such as workers' occupations can identify serious differences between the sexes, as is shown in the following examples on occupational segregation. The graph shows how in most OECD countries, women's employment is concentrated in a relatively small number of occupations, far fewer than for men. Each bar describes how many occupations make up at least half of the total employed population. The dark bar refers to occupations for women. The light bar refers to men's. On average, half of women's employment is accounted for by only some 10 occupations, compared with about 20 for men. In other words, women overall have access to far fewer occupations than do men, except in the Czech Republic. It is also fundamental to know in what specific occupations women and men are concentrated, and whether female-dominated occupations may be lower qualified, lower paid, or of lower social status. Does the social status of occupation depend on the sex of the workers? Here is an example from Sweden, showing the percentage of employed in the 30 largest occupations, where the percentage of women can be seen from the bars on the left side and the percentage of men from the bars on the right side. The length of the bars indicates whether the occupation is male or female dominated. For example, 97% of office secretaries are women, while only 1% of women are motor vehicle mechanics and repair workers, the most male-dominated occupation. Let's examine income as another important topic when analysing gender. Do women, on average, earn the same as men when they are employed? Is equal pay for work of equal value applied among women and men? The graph shows data from selected CIS countries related to the average difference between a monthly salary of women and men. In all countries, male earnings are on average more than 30% higher than those of women, with Georgia showing a gap that reaches 50%. Women generally find themselves in lower paid occupations and are promoted less often. But the gap is evident also within occupational groups and educational attainment levels. This is well illustrated in another Swedish example. The graph shows on the left side the average monthly salary of women for the 10 largest occupation groups, and on the right side the average salary of men for the same groups. Results show that in 8 out of 10 most common occupational groups, women on average earn less than men. By highlighting the monthly salary of the top and bottom occupations, business professionals and cleaners, the differences in gender pay are readily apparent. And going further in detail, data from the Quality of Work Life Survey carried out by Statistics Finland in 2003 show that 44% of men were proposed an increase in personal pay in the last 5 years, while only 29% of women were. As already mentioned, a major constraint on women's participation in the labour force relates to their family responsibilities. The extent and form of their participation is highly connected to their marital status and to whether they have small children or other persons requiring care in their households. However, men's participation in the labour force is not affected by family responsibilities. The examples reported above on the topics that are particularly relevant for analysing gender in labour emphasise the need to review the content of the data collection systems. Labour force surveys, which in many countries are the most important source of information for labour statistics, should be better utilised to collect information on these relevant topics. An example of this effort is given by the Labour Force Survey conducted in 2005 in all European countries, where a new common module was included on the reconciliation between work and family life. The following questions were captured in this module. How does the lack of suitable care services for children and other dependent persons impact labour force participation? What degree of flexibility is offered at work in terms of reconciliation with family life? How often is leave of absence taken to care for children or deal with emergencies? Now that we have explored the first step related to the topics that need to be incorporated in labour statistics, let's move on to step 2 to define and classify variables. We'll start with the definitions. Focusing on specific topics and gender issues is insufficient because the data collection framework and instruments themselves are often gender biased. Concepts and definitions used in data collection need to adequately reflect the diversity of women and men. But how can the most common biases be corrected? Employment should better measure seasonal and casual activities in which women often engage to a larger extent than do men. It should also more accurately include persons who work a few hours, whose social role is to be a housewife, student, or retired. The production of unpaid goods, which is also a women-dominated activity, should also be better recorded. The informal sector is often not covered sufficiently, excluding, for example, agriculture and domestic work. Secondary jobs and workers without fixed work location are also often underreported. Another bias relates to the measurement of income from employment. Very often the concept used refers only to wage rates and earnings, which excludes bonuses, payments in kind and services, and Social Security benefits such as family-related payments. But these may be precisely the areas where distinctions between men and women may be more important. Only when data collection frameworks properly take gender diversity into consideration do data really become meaningful. Gender bias can also be introduced by classification systems. For example, the International Standard Classification of Occupations tends to have fewer subdivisions of occupations in which women predominate, such as office secretary, while the occupations which are male-dominated, such as craftsperson, are more finely delineated. A process carried out in Nepal for the 2001 census gives an example of how classification can be made more gender relevant. The Occupation and Industry Classification Committee reviewed the gender bias in the classifications to be used, then produced new codes for occupation and industry that provided more detailed, gender-sensitive breakdowns for women and men. The table reports examples of these new activities, which include handicraft workers, fruit, vegetable and related preservers, and basket weavers. Once we are sure that definitions and classifications adequately take gender differences into consideration, we are ready to move on to Step 3, the right measurement and methodologies to avoid stereotypes, social and cultural factors that might produce gender biases when designing question wordings and references. Measurements should be made as independently as possible from respondents' own perceptions as well as from interviewers' biases. Two concrete examples show how different question formulations change the number of people measured as working or not working. Before 1994, the United States Current Population Survey opening question to capture employment status read, "What were you doing most of last week? Working, keeping house, or something else?" For women who primarily kept house but also did some paid work, this question led to underreporting of women's employment. A survey redesign to avoid gender bias changed the question to, "Last week, did you do any work for pay or profit?" Survey results increased workers, primarily women, who usually worked fewer than 10 hours per week. Pakistan's Labour Force Survey recently added an activity list to the employment questionnaire to better account for people engaged in informal and unregulated work, covering agricultural operations, food processing, construction work, clothes making, and so on. This table shows that the activity rate obtained for women, using the additional questions, identified 50% more women as part of the labour force, from almost 20% to over 40%. Using the standard question, only 19% of women were considered as active, whereas there was no change for men's activity rate. Let's move on to the fourth and last step to incorporate gender into labour statistics, the presentation and dissemination of labour statistics. All indicators should be calculated by a variety of disaggregations to best reveal the relation between the work situation of women and men. These include sex as well as level of education, age group and family context, such as marital status, presence and number of preschool children and elderly persons requiring care. How the data are presented has a great impact on the understanding of gender disparity in the labour market. This first graph tells a story of almost equal participation of women and men in the labour market in Sweden from 2000 to 2005. The same activity status of women and men in Sweden can be further described in more detail. Now the story shows great differences between how women and men participate in the labour force over time. Women have a larger share of part-time employment, while men are predominantly employed in full-time jobs. There is a change happening over time with employed men, where men are modestly increasing their engagement in part-time work, perhaps to take on more of their family responsibilities. It is important to emphasize that how the data are presented will impact the message the reader takes away. We want to ensure that the messages adequately reflect the lives of women and men in society. We conclude this presentation by going again through the checklist of 4 key questions adopted by the 17th International Conference of Labour Statisticians in 2003 that represents an important path to good practice in mainstreaming gender into labour statistics. Are all relevant topics covered to describe gender concerns such as unpaid work, employment in the informal economy, etc. Are all work situations adequately measured? Are variables properly defined and classified to allow relevant gender comparisons to be made? Are all statistics presented in sufficient detail to clearly reveal the differences and similarities between men and women in the labour market? The examination of national labour statistics in terms of these 4 questions will reveal strengths and weaknesses of currently available statistics. They will guide the need for, or direction of, improvements to end the chronic underreporting and misrepresentation of women's contribution to national economies. To make mainstreaming of gender in labour statistics a reality, political will is needed not only in statistical agencies but at all levels.